Thank you, Patty. I'm really excited to be here and be able to talk a little bit about one specific activity that I think can make a massive difference on the outcome of a project. And this is something that I've seen over and over again in my time at CDMOs, in biotech, and now as an independent consultant. And that's how you get a project started right. And that makes sense, of course, if you get projects started the right way. That's usually a recipe for success. And it also avoids, banging your head against the wall, which I've read burns 150 calories an hour, but there are probably some easier ways how you can lose some of that quarantine weight and get your projects, at the CDMOs to run correctly. Again, I've seen over and over again how sponsor companies get this wrong and fail to get the project started off in the right way. Of course, it's ultimately up to the CDMO to execute on the project, but it's your responsibility, I think, as a sponsor to provide expectations and also to set the framework for how you'd like to operate. So I'd really like to encourage everyone to have a formal project kickoff meeting, even for projects that are fairly small, or it might seem on first glance everything is completely clear. Well, I'll tell you in a minute why I think that's important. Of course, ideally you'd like to do this in person, and that's hard to do at the moment in the situation we live in, but I'm sure that'll change again in the future. And so we have to rely on technology to help us out as we do today. So what are some of the things that I've seen from my experience are really important that you cover in a project kickoff meeting? The first thing I'd suggest is that you provide a thorough overview of your company, the technology platform, the disease you're targeting, and how your drug can help patients. This is really important and somewhat obvious, but easy to forget. Because you want to build that engagement with the scientists at the CDMO. Trust me, everyone who works at a CDMO is as interested as you are in helping people with disease, in improving the lives of patients, and just making a difference. But it's harder to do that at a CDMO because you're further away from things. And if you work in a biotech, you probably have regular meetings to talk about the disease, you talk to advocates and patients. You don't really have that in the CDMO. So if you kind of bring that to the scientists at your collaborators, you'll see a huge difference in the level of engagement that you'll see. The next thing that's really important, and a lot of companies, I think, get this wrong, is outlining expectations and providing information. And I think this comes from the fact that a typical project with a CDMO has quite a long lead time leading up to the actual project. I mean, you're speaking to business development multiple times, there'll be proposals, revisions. So it's natural to assume that all that information that you shared and all those discussions you had will make it to the project team. But my experience from doing many of these projects is that a lot of times it doesn't. And of course that creates a problem because you assume everyone knows what you've said all along, but the people who actually execute the chemistry or whatever the project is have never heard this before. So I'd really suggest starting at zero, going through everything again, the history, the contract, the deliverable. And it's also a good way of outlining your expectations when it comes to communication, project-specific items. And yes, it might seem a little bit redundant, but I think that investment of those 30 minutes or so that it might take to go through that will turn out to be a really smart investment and avoids a lot of meetings later on to fix problems. And then the final item that I think is really important is to provide background and shared context. Now, why is that important? I think at times as sponsors, we can be overly focused on providing very limited information about the problem that needs to be solved. And that leads to frustration on both sides. I remember a project from several years ago where at the early stages of the project, there was a lot of confusion on both sides, a lot of questions like, well, why did you run this experiment and not that one? Why did you change that? We didn't want you to change that. And we ultimately actually solved that actually by convincing the sponsor company to hold a kickoff meeting 3 weeks after we'd already started and kind of do a reset and have them talk about what they wanted to accomplish, what were some of the regulatory constraints in terms of what's been filed. And suddenly the CDMO was able to bring a lot more to the table. And if you think about it, this is how you approach that in your own internal team. I think many of us have seen that difference that it makes how you state a problem. If you tell a scientist to run an experiment, they'll run that reaction. But if you tell someone, what's the problem? Why is it important that we solve it? He or she will go off and use their hands in their head to solve that problem. And it works the same thing with CDMOs. So again, I strongly believe it's really important to get things started the right way. And these are a couple other things you can consider there. Obviously, there are many other things that you might want to cover. But I'll stop here and we can go into more details later during the Q&A.